OCO. My name is Farina King, and I'm a historian based at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah. I am now at Park Hill, Oklahoma, of former Indian Territory and Cherokee Nation. This is the place where George and Minerva Ross Merle came through the forced removal of Cherokees, the Trail of Tears. This is a site that a lot of my students and fellow scholars have been drawn to because of the complicated histories here. That Jennie Ross Cobb, the Native American woman trailblazer that we're featuring in this discussion and video today, she helped to carry the knowledge about the ups, the downs, hate, love, war, life, death, slavery, freedoms, struggles, and accomplishments that happened in this place over years and many years of time.
Yeah, she was very well traveled, and she always viewed herself as a Cherokee.
She was down in Texas and had the opportunity to come back here. She was raising her two grandchildren. That's Jenny Biggers Cook and Cliff Biggers. She was raising them. Her daughter had died previously, and so she came back here. This was an opportunity for her to bring her grandchildren back to the Cherokee Nation. And she had a hard road to hoe, but she wanted to come home, and this was home. And she had family here. and I think for her, and to bring those two grandkids back and let them understand a little bit about their Cherokee heritage.
She spent quite a bit of her younger years in East Texas, the East Texas oil area. And she was always wanted to want to learn. So I think she had a quest for knowledge.
A very sharp, talented woman with an eye for doing it right.
Her nature was, you got a job, do the job to the best of your ability, learn everything you can about it, and make it meaningful. And I think that was the key to her picking up photography at her early age. Is it was new. It was something new to learn. It was something new to do. Nobody else was doing it, so take it on and learn to do it. And as she used to say, she says everything she learned by trying it, and the things that worked, and the things that didn't work, she learned not to do again.
After she married Cliff Biggers, then they moved around a lot. He was involved in assaying gas and oil wells. And so they moved around a lot and eventually ended up in Arlington, Texas, where he worked from there. He died young. And when they moved to Texas and settled somewhere, I noticed she got into the floral business. At one point, she was making the wreaths to put on the horses when they won at the tracks. She apparently had a contract with them. And she did a number, but she had a flower shop. And she grafted on fruit trees. She was very, very much into gardening.
She was in a rose or a garden club in Arlington, and they took the initiative to build a municipal rose garden, and then they entered that rose garden in a national competition by the Women's Home Companion, and they actually won. In 1933, they won the municipal rose garden.
Family members had described her as being just so absolutely kind and wonderful, but she was always a very quiet person.
If you accept a job, accept it with the outlook that you're going to do it to the best of your ability.
On her wedding day, the Tahlequah Daily Arrow, I believe it was, they sent a reporter over to write about this really grand event taking place at Hunter's home. And they talked about her just being one of the most celebrated and loved young women in their community, and how much they're going to miss her. So
I don't think it was so much a taught lesson as it was an observed lesson, but it was certainly easy to observe because that was the way she was.
She was someone who was very much respected among the people who knew her, among the people that she associated with.
So she was quite a lady. And I think the comment somebody had made to me was, she was a class act.
She took her job, whatever it was, very seriously. She decided that she was going to do it to the best of her ability. I observed that. It wasn't something that she taught me. It was something I picked up from just observation. If she took a job, she wanted to do it to the very best of her ability. And if I was to say anything I learned from her, it's work ethic.
We are in the west room of the Hunter's home, formerly known as the Merle home. Minerva would pass on and George would marry her sister Amanda, and this is where their family would stay and be raised. And behind me is a portrait of Mary Jane Ross, one of the sisters of Minerva and Amanda. This is the space where Jennie Ross Cobb would grow up and dwell as she was a part of the Ross family. And she got her camera here and would take pictures all over the grounds of the site. And in that way, she was a public historian, preserving the history through her photographs, but also through her research, her efforts to document and preserve her family history and share that through giving tours and becoming eventually a curator of the Hunter's home and helping to restore and maintain the home over the many years since the 19th century. And through some difficult times that the Cherokee Nation faced with allotment and targeted efforts to erase or terminate their nationhood, Jennie Ross Cobb was a key part of sustaining the history and stories of not only her family and community, but also of the Cherokee Nation as a loyal country woman through those times and a seminarian alumna.
A lot of the history of the home involved the family history because, again, Merle married a couple of the daughters of Lewis, which was actually the nieces of John Ross. And I think in general, most of the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and the great-great-grandchildren of John Ross took a great deal of pride in that relationship.
She was raised in the house. I should say raised in her teenage years. Probably her father, Robert Bruce Ross, moved in maybe 1894, something like 1894, and they were there to probably 1906 at the behest of the Merles. At the time they moved in, the Merles still technically owned it. Then allotment came.
She used many of her old photographs of the home. Those were shot while she was in residence there. Her father, Robert Bruce Ross, and mother, Fanny Thornton Ross, they took up residence there as caretakers. They were never the official owners, but they took care of it for a number of years. And the younger Ross children were raised there partly, Jennie being one of them. So she has all of these wonderful images of how the home looked at that time.
She lived in the home when she was young, all the way up to her 20s when she got married in her early 20s.
Her teenage years living in the house.
And many of those photographs were used as she was trying to bring everything back in together and get some kind of sense of, what was there and what should be returned. And this would have been in the 1940s whenever she returned. You see so much rigidity in the photography of the late 19th century going into the next. But you also see kind of a looseness of subject matter, allowing people to be who they are instead of standing really stoic and still for the camera.
And of course, I thought Jennie was wonderful because she was a photographer and she had a photographer's eye.
But by the time that Jennie came around, the technology had developed so that there was a little bit more movement allowed. And you could be yourself in front of the camera. And I think that they began to actually encourage that, they being the camera companies that were starting to market to more audiences rather than just the professionals. So
she was attracted to an ad. She saw either a magazine ad or a newspaper ad about photography, and that's what attracted her to it. Now, where she got her first camera, she actually had 2 cameras, and they were both on display at Hunter's home, and the plates were all there. Or some of her plates were there.
She took the camera all around her home and all around her community. When she got to the Cherokee National Female Seminary, she brought it with her and photographed all of her friends going about town. I don't know that she was trying to make like some kind of a historical document or record, but just having fun and seeing what she could do. I mean, clearly you can see in her photographs that she has an eye for staging, for just the way that composition falls with, having multiple items and objects in the frame.
And it would make sense that she would become like the school photographer. As you notice in a lot of her pictures, it's women at their finest, so to speak, for that era. And so I think she wanted to document that. She wanted to do that for the school.
Another person that I met during my research on Jennie was a lady named Mary Elizabeth Good. And she had been an editor, I think, for the American Scene magazine at the Gilcrease. But she was friends with Jennie. She had met her, and she had taken with Jennie's permission, taken her glass plates and made contact prints. Mary Elizabeth Good was also a photographer, and she made these glass prints. And then they were given back, and then they went back into the family. But it was from those, I took photographs of her photographs, of Mary Elizabeth Good's photographs. And that's what the Oklahoma Historical Society has. Now we have the glass plates, but back then we didn't have the glass plates. And of course, those photographs that she took back then were just fantastic because they told us what it looked like when she was there.
There is a photo of what I never assume, would be some of the students at the National Seminary. They're walking behind the Hunter's home. And there are 3 little African-American girls to the right. And it appears as if there's one young woman in her big flowy white gown, turning and looking and talking to the little girls who have, I believe it's a bucket, but what you kind of see is a clear distinction among classes of people. Classes existed in Cherokee Nation in that day.
She didn't shy away from it. She told me that John Ross was a slave owner also. And so when my grandmother would tell me they had slaves, she would say it kind of matter-of-factly, like that was the way it was at that time.
The experience that Jennie lived, the experience that she captured, was not the experience of every Cherokee. You always have to take that into consideration, that as refreshing, as interesting, as really fascinating as her images are of just showing what Cherokee Nation was going through at the turn of the century, you don't get the full breadth and picture of what the Cherokee Nation was, because you definitely have people who did not live along the same kind of ideals and same kinds of rituals and practices as Jennie and the Ross family. That certainly can be said also for the freedmen, who, they still lived segregated for many years within Cherokee Nation. And that speaks to just how far we've had to come from that point to the point that we are now.
Then she, of course, graduated from the Cherokee Female Seminary in 1900. And then she taught for about 5 years until she married. She taught at a bunch of different places, and she would take pictures. There's a number of pictures of when she was in Claremore. There's a pictures when she was teaching out at Pawpaw years ago. And I think all the kids were full bloods, and she could speak and understanding Cherokee. And she needed to, because she was the one who was teaching them.
We moved from Arlington, Texas to Park Hill to take over the curatorship of Hunter's Home. She was very heavily involved in the fact that the house had been changed quite a bit over the years. And so she set about with the help of the state, working with her and restoring it back to what it was when she lived there. She lived there as a young person. Her father and his whole family lived there. So she kind of grew up in that area.
She was to be the hostess. The property was acquired in 1948, and it wasn't until 1952 they decided they really had to have somebody in charge out there who knew what they were doing. And she was perfect because she lived in the house. She had all the connections, and what she couldn't get from family members, she would get from older Cherokee families in the area. She had deep roots and deep connections. Her father was an important person, Robert Bruce Ross. What impressed me about her so much was she was not trained in museum work, but she was doing it right without anybody telling her. What she did is, when she would try to acquire collections for the house, she would photograph them, and she would, write it down.
She was trying to learn really the entire history of the home. And
she wasn't a professional. This was just a hobby. It was a hobby. And now, and somebody, I think it was Emma Doubt, who was one of the researchers, she said, well, there's been an exhibit in London. So some of her images have gone around the world, more so to speak.
But I did know that my grandmother spent a lot of time with a lot of older people, interviewing them about their family histories. She seemed to have questioned some of the written history. I want to know for myself what really took place as much as I can. And that's why I say I think there were so many occasions where she would have people, even people older than her, of a generation beyond her, where she'd have them over and talk to them about what they knew, because the generation before her would have experienced removal.
Because she was doing her research, and she was documenting what she was doing. And so she was somebody after my my heart, somebody who knew how to, collections care and so on. So she's the reason we have so much at Hunter's Home, is that it's because of her. She set the standards. She was she was the right person at the right time to come here and do the restoration.
Cherokee Nation has a rich, highly varied history, and there is the door that we have through her work and through her efforts that she did later on in life. That is a wonderful entryway into, learning about the government, learning about what happened with the tribe in those days. And it's such an important, vital period of our history.
In many of my classes, as an associate professor of history, I tell my students to read place. Think about the impressions of history, how history leaves its traces and layers in all places and sites around us. Here at Hunter's Home, where Jennie Ross Cobb dwelled, navigated, and was trying to understand her family history and the stories that happened here over a couple centuries, you can read Place and just think about all the different peoples who have navigated these spaces, whether we're conscious of it or not, that they matter to us. Before the Cherokee were forcibly removed here, this was Osage country, where Osage and Indigenous peoples had lived since time immemorial. And then when Cherokees came here to start a home, they also came with enslaved African, Black Americans whose identities would also change over time. And there were enslaved peoples who lived here, were a part of this household, and kept the site and the plantation going. A past that's very controversial and difficult for Americans and all people to grapple with to this day. And that's something that Jennie Ross Cobb didn't shy away from. She didn't shy away from the dark episodes of history or the complicated past. She just tried to understand them and also to share those stories with her own posterity, the grandchildren that she would raise, and with the public, with people in general, so that these histories could continue. She would be, around these waters, walking around here, and I tried to show you all some images that she's taken on the grounds that were a part of preserving and helping to save Hunter's home from crumbling and falling apart. And some of these images are like the one of her father, Robert Bruce Ross, and the spring house here that she would take, or one of her mother on the porch up by the house, Frances Ross. And Jennie Ross Cobb belonged to a special family who were leaders in the Cherokee Nation, like her father, Robert Bruce Ross Sr., who served as a treasurer among the Cherokee Nation and in different roles. That leadership in many ways passed on to her. Hard work ethic and a pursuit for knowledge and understanding that she would share as an educator, a teacher in Indian Territory, and even from her early years and days at the Cherokee National Female Seminary, when she was using a small box camera to document everyday life. Maybe, they were things that other people wouldn't care about or they think are trivial, but we owe so much to her and her valuable work of helping us have a window into the past during Indian Territory of the late 19th century to 1906.